The Kansas wind came hard that morning, whipping across the prairie like it had something to prove. Eleanor Hayes stood on the porch of her ranch house, watching the dust devils dance in the distance, trying to ignore the 3 horses approaching from the east. She knew who they were before she could make out their faces. The Frontier Land Development Company never sent just one man to deliver bad news. Her hands trembled as she smoothed down her worn cotton dress, the same one she had mended twice already this month. Behind her, through the open door, she could hear her 7-year-old daughter Mary humming while playing with her rag doll. The sound made Eleanor's chest tighten. Everything she did now, every decision she made, was for that little voice, for that innocent melody that somehow survived in this harsh land. The riders pulled up in front of her fence, and the lead man, Mr. Thornton, tipped his hat with exaggerated politeness. His smile never reached his eyes. He was dressed too fine for Kansas, with a silk vest that seemed to mock the dust covering everything else. The 2 men flanking him looked like they had been hired for intimidation rather than conversation. Eleanor descended the porch steps slowly, buying herself time to steady her voice. She had been through this before 3 times in the past 2 months. Each visit brought the same message wrapped in different words. Her husband had died 6 months ago, thrown from his horse during a storm, and the loan he had taken to expand the cattle operation was now due. The bank had sold the debt to Thornton's company, and they wanted immediate payment or the land. Thornton dismounted with practiced ease and approached the fence. He pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket and held it up like evidence in a trial. The numbers on that paper represented everything Eleanor had left in the world. This patch of Kansas prairie where she and Thomas had built their dreams, where Mary had taken her first steps, where 3 years of backbreaking work had finally started to show promise. The cattle were healthy now. The winter had been survived, and the spring rains had been generous. In 3 months, she could sell enough beef to make a substantial payment. In 6 months, she might even clear half the debt. But Thornton's company did not deal in maybes and might-haves. They dealt in immediate transactions and legal foreclosures. Eleanor gripped the fence post, her knuckles white. She had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times in her mind, had prepared arguments about fairness and widows' rights and the value of patience. But when she opened her mouth, what came out was something raw, something she had not planned. "Please," she heard herself say, the word catching in her throat. "Please stop. Just give me until autumn. I can pay you then. I swear on my daughter's life I can pay you." The desperation in her own voice made her feel small, made her feel like she was betraying Thomas's memory by begging. But pride would not keep a roof over Mary's head. Pride would not plant next season's crops. Thornton's expression did not change. He had heard pleas before, probably heard them every week. He started to respond, his mouth forming words that Eleanor knew would crush what little hope she had left. But then his gaze shifted, looking past her shoulder, and his words died mid-sentence. His companions stiffened in their saddles, and one of them muttered something under his breath. Eleanor turned to see what had stolen their attention. Across the fence line, sitting motionless on a massive chestnut horse, was Jacob Sterling. The neighboring rancher had appeared like a ghost, silent and still, watching the scene unfold with those dark, unreadable eyes that had made him a legend and a mystery in equal measure. He said nothing. He did not need to. His presence alone changed everything about the moment, and Eleanor felt the air itself shift as Thornton's confidence wavered for the first time since his arrival. Jacob Sterling had not planned to ride his fence line that morning. He had plenty of work waiting back at his own spread, repairs that could not wait and cattle that needed checking. But something had pulled him toward the Hayes property, some instinct he had learned to trust during his years alone on the prairie. Now, watching the scene unfold, he understood why. He recognized Thornton immediately. The land company man had tried his tactics on other homesteaders in the county, always with the same result. Families displaced, properties absorbed, small ranchers swallowed up by larger interests. Jacob had watched it happen 4 times in the past year, and each time he had told himself it was not his concern, that every man and woman had to fight their own battles in this country. But something about Eleanor Hayes's voice, the way that single word "please" had cut through the wind, had lodged itself somewhere in his chest. He had heard her story from the town folk, knew about Thomas Hayes's passing, knew about the little girl who played in the yard, while her mother worked sunrise to sunset, trying to hold on to a dream that was slipping through her fingers like Kansas dust. Jacob had been alone for 8 years now, ever since he had left his family's ranch in Missouri after his father's passing and his brother's betrayal. He had come to Kansas to forget, to build something that belonged to him alone, to avoid the complications that came with caring about other people's problems. He had succeeded perhaps too well. The townspeople called him the Silent Rancher, and children whispered stories about the man who lived alone in the hills and never smiled. He had built his reputation on hard work and harder silence. He did business when necessary, helped neighbors during harvest when they asked directly, and otherwise kept to himself. It was a life that suited him, or so he had convinced himself over the years. No attachments meant no disappointments, no betrayals, no losses that could break a man's spirit. But watching Eleanor Hayes stand up to Thornton, watching her beg for time to save her home, Jacob felt something crack in the walls he had built around himself. It was not romance or attraction, nothing so simple. It was recognition. He saw in her struggle something of his own past, the desperation of trying to hold on to something meaningful in a world designed to take it away from you. Thornton had noticed him now, was staring at him with a mixture of irritation and calculation. The land company man knew Jacob's reputation, knew that he controlled one of the more successful ranches in the county, knew that he was not someone to dismiss lightly. But Thornton also knew that Jacob Sterling minded his own business, never interfered in other people's affairs, never took sides in disputes that did not concern him directly. Jacob could feel Eleanor's eyes on him too, though she had turned back to face Thornton. She was probably wondering what he was doing there, probably hoping he might say something that would help her cause. But Jacob said nothing. He simply sat on his horse watching, his face revealing nothing of the thoughts churning behind his eyes. The silence stretched out, became uncomfortable, became a presence of its own. Thornton shifted his weight, clearly unsure how to proceed. He had been in the middle of delivering his ultimatum when Jacob had appeared, and now the words seemed to stick in his throat. There was something about being watched by Jacob Sterling that made men second-guess themselves, made them wonder if their actions would stand up to that silent, unwavering scrutiny. Finally, Thornton cleared his throat and addressed Jacob directly. "This is private business, Sterling, between Mrs. Hayes and my company. Nothing that concerns you." Jacob still said nothing. He simply adjusted his reins slightly, a movement so small it was almost imperceptible, but it kept everyone's attention locked on him. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. In the barn behind the Hayes house, a horse whinnied, and somewhere a crow called out a warning to its companions. Eleanor found her voice again, stronger now. "Mr. Thornton, I have given you my answer. I need time and I will have it. This land is my daughter's inheritance, and I will not abandon it without fighting for what is right." Thornton's face hardened. "Mrs. Hayes, the law is on my side. You have until the end of this week to vacate the property or pay the full amount. Those are your only options." He turned back toward his horse, clearly intending to leave, to let the weight of his ultimatum sink in. That was when Jacob Sterling finally moved. He guided his horse forward, crossing onto Hayes' property with deliberate slowness, positioning himself between Thornton and his mount. Still, he said nothing, but the message was clear. The conversation was not over just because Thornton wanted it to be. The town of Covenant Springs had seen stranger things than Jacob Sterling appearing at the general store on a Tuesday afternoon, but not many. He moved through the aisles with purpose, gathering supplies he normally ordered by mail, making himself visible in a way that was entirely unlike him. By the time he reached the counter, half the store's customers had found reasons to linger near the front, pretending to examine goods they had no intention of buying. Jacob paid for his purchases with cash, counted out precisely, and then did something that sent whispers rippling through the room. He asked the clerk, loudly enough for everyone to hear, about the legal requirements for a land partnership in Kansas. The clerk, a nervous young man named Timothy, stammered through an explanation about contracts and county registrations and witnessed signatures. Jacob listened with apparent interest, thanked Timothy, and left the store. Behind him, the gossip erupted like a dam breaking. By sundown, half the county would know that Jacob Sterling was considering some kind of business arrangement, and by morning, Speculation would have filled in the details with increasingly elaborate theories. Jacob had planned it that way. In a small town, information spread faster than wildfire, and he needed certain people to hear certain things before he made his next move. He rode out to the Hayes Ranch just as the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. Painting the prairie in shades of amber and gold, Eleanor was in the yard, hanging laundry on a line that stretched between two posts. Her daughter Mary sat on the porch steps, singing softly to herself while she braided strips of cloth together. The scene had a fragile domesticity to it, a sense of normalcy that Jacob knew was held together by sheer determination and Eleanor's refusal to show fear in front of her child. Eleanor saw him approaching and paused, a damp sheet still in her hands. Her expression was guarded but not unfriendly. Jacob dismounted and tied his horse to the fence, taking his time organizing his thoughts. This was the most important conversation he would have in years, and he could not afford to fumble it. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice rusty from disuse, "I have a proposition for you." Eleanor lowered the sheet slowly. "I am listening, Mr. Sterling." Jacob pulled a folded paper from his shirt pocket, a document he had spent most of the previous night drafting by lamplight. "I propose a partnership. You need capital and time to save your ranch. I have resources and land that could benefit from expansion. If we combine operations temporarily, pooling livestock and profits, we can satisfy Thornton's immediate demands and give you breathing room to establish stability." Eleanor's eyes widened. She stepped closer, studying his face as if trying to decode some hidden message. "That is very generous, Mr. Sterling, but I cannot accept charity. I have my pride, even if I have little else." Jacob shook his head. "Not charity, business. Your land borders mine. Your water access is better than mine in dry seasons. Your grazing land complements my herd rotation needs. A partnership benefits us both. You get financial relief. I get expanded operations without the complications of buying you out. When you are stable again, we dissolve the arrangement. Simple and practical. It was a lie, but a necessary one." Jacob's ranch was profitable enough that he did not need Eleanor's land or her limited resources, but he had framed it in a way that allowed her to accept help without feeling diminished. He could see her mind working, calculating possibilities, weighing pride against survival. "What would people say?" Eleanor asked quietly. "A widow and a bachelor in a business partnership?" "This town talks, Mr. Sterling. You know that better than anyone." Jacob had anticipated this concern. "Let them talk. The contract will be legal and public. Everything documented and proper. Your reputation remains intact. Mine was never good enough to damage." He said it without bitterness, just stating a fact. Eleanor looked toward her daughter, then back at Jacob. "Why are you doing this?" "You do not know me. You do not owe me anything. What happened yesterday with Thornton? You could have ridden away, but you did not. And now this, why?" Jacob was silent for a long moment. He could tell her about his own losses, about his brother's betrayal, about the years of isolation that had taught him what mattered and what did not. But those words would not come, not yet, maybe never. So instead he told her a simpler truth, because sometimes standing by and doing nothing is the same as being part of the problem. "And I am tired of being part of the problem." The county clerk's office in Covenant Springs occupied the ground floor of the courthouse, a sturdy limestone building that stood as the town's monument to law and civilization. Jacob and Eleanor arrived on Thursday morning. Their partnership contract rolled carefully and tied with string, ready to be witnessed and registered. Word of their arrangement had spread exactly as Jacob had anticipated, and the reaction had been mixed. The Women's Church Auxiliary had spent an entire evening debating the propriety of the situation, eventually concluding that business was business, and a widow had the right to preserve her late husband's legacy by whatever legal means necessary. The men at the saloon had been less diplomatic, with several offering crude jokes about Sterling's sudden interest in neighborly cooperation. Jacob ignored it all. He had spent 8 years being the subject of gossip and speculation. A few more whispers would not change anything about his life or his plans. Eleanor, however, was less accustomed to being the center of attention. She walked with her head high, but Jacob could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her jaw tightened when they passed clusters of townspeople who stopped their conversations to stare. Inside the clerk's office, They found an unexpected complication. Mr. Thornton was there, leaning against the counter with calculated casualness, a thin smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He straightened when he saw them enter, and his expression shifted to something that resembled satisfaction. "Well, well," Thornton said smoothly. "I heard rumors, but I confess I did not believe them until now. The silent rancher and the desperate widow forming an alliance. How very resourceful." Jacob ignored the bait and approached the desk where the clerk sat. "We are here to register a partnership contract. Standard procedure. Nothing that concerns anyone but us." Thornton stepped closer, his voice taking on a tone of false concern. "Oh, but it does concern me, Sterling. You see, Mrs. Hayes owes my company a substantial sum. Any business arrangement she enters into could be seen as an attempt to hide assets or delay legitimate debt collection. I would hate for you to find yourself entangled in legal complications simply because you tried to help a neighbor." Eleanor's face flushed. "That is a lie, and you know it. This partnership is legitimate. It changes nothing about my debt, except that I will now have the means to pay it according to a reasonable schedule." Thornton pulled out a different document from his jacket, this one thick with official-looking seals. "Actually, Mrs. Hayes, there is a clause in the loan agreement your late husband signed. It specifically prohibits the transfer or encumbrance of the property without the lender's consent. A partnership that includes your land as an asset could be interpreted as a violation of that clause, which would make the entire debt immediately due." The clerk looked between them nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation unfolding in his office. Jacob felt a flash of anger, hot and sharp, but he kept his face neutral. He had learned long ago that showing emotion in a negotiation was the same as showing weakness. "Then we will structure the partnership differently," Jacob said calmly. "My assets remain mine. Her assets remain hers. We form a cooperative arrangement for livestock management and profit sharing, with no transfer of land titles. Her property stays in her name exclusively. No clause is violated." Thornton's smile faded slightly. He had not expected Jacob to adapt so quickly. The land company man was accustomed to dealing with desperate homesteaders who had no legal knowledge and no resources to hire lawyers. Jacob Sterling was different, and Thornton was beginning to understand that he had underestimated his opponent. The clerk cleared his throat. "That would be acceptable under Kansas law, gentlemen. A management cooperative with profit sharing does not constitute a transfer or encumbrance. I can register that type of agreement without any issue." Jacob unrolled his contract and laid it on the counter. "I wrote it that way to begin with. Every detail anticipated and addressed." He looked directly at Thornton. "Unless you have some other objection we should know about." Thornton's jaw tightened. His entire strategy had been built on intimidating isolated homesteaders who had no allies and no options. Jacob's intervention had disrupted that strategy completely. The land company man gathered his papers and moved toward the door, but he paused before leaving, turning back to deliver one final shot. "You are only delaying the inevitable, Sterling. People like you cannot stop progress. This county is changing, and those who resist change get swept aside. Remember that when this little arrangement of yours falls apart." After he left, the office felt larger, the air easier to breathe. The clerk processed their paperwork with efficient professionalism, stamping documents and recording details in his ledger. When everything was complete, he handed them each a certified copy of their partnership agreement. Outside, on the courthouse steps, Eleanor finally allowed herself to show relief. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, and when she opened them again, there were tears threatening to spill over. "Thank you," she whispered. "I do not know how I will ever repay you for this." Jacob folded his copy of the contract and tucked it inside his jacket. "The partnership repays itself. We both benefit. That is how it works." He said it firmly, needing her to believe it, needing to maintain the fiction that this was purely business. Because if either of them acknowledged what it really was, an act of compassion from a man who had forgotten how to show compassion, then the walls Jacob had built around himself might finally crumble completely. Summer arrived on the Kansas prairie with its usual intensity, bringing heat that shimmered off the grasslands and thunderstorms that rolled across the horizon like promises. Jacob and Eleanor settled into the routine of their partnership with careful professionalism, maintaining boundaries while learning to work together. Jacob brought his crew of 3 ranch hands, experienced men who knew cattle, and asked no questions about the arrangement. They helped Eleanor repair her fences, strengthen her barn, and organize her herd for better management. In return, Eleanor's superior water access provided relief during the hottest weeks. When Jacob's creek ran low and his cattle needed alternatives, Mary, Eleanor's daughter, lost her initial shyness around Jacob after he fixed her broken swing without being asked. She started leaving small gifts for him, wildflowers tied with string or drawings of horses that he would find on his saddle. Jacob did not know what to do with these gestures, so he kept them, tucking the flowers between the pages of his account books and storing the drawings in his desk drawer. The town continued to watch their arrangement with interest that bordered on obsession. Every trip to the general store brought new questions disguised as casual conversation. Every Sunday after church brought knowing looks from the congregation. Jacob and Eleanor maintained their professional distance, communicating about cattle counts and market prices, carefully avoiding anything that might fuel additional speculation. But something was shifting despite their caution. Eleanor began to understand Jacob's silences, learned to read the subtle changes in his expression that others missed. She discovered that his quietness was not coldness, but something else, a kind of careful consideration that came from years of being disappointed by words that proved empty. Jacob, in turn, saw past Eleanor's determined optimism to the exhaustion underneath. He noticed when she pushed herself too hard, when she worked through lunch because there was too much to do and not enough daylight to do it. He started bringing extra supplies when he visited, leaving them in her barn without comment, pretending not to see her grateful expression when she discovered them. The first cattle sale came in late July, a regional auction that drew ranchers from 3 counties. Jacob and Eleanor attended together, presenting their combined herd and negotiating prices as partners. The sale went better than either had anticipated. The market was strong, the cattle were healthy, and buyers were impressed by the quality of their stock. When they counted their earnings that evening, sitting at Eleanor's kitchen table with account books spread between them, the numbers told a hopeful story. After splitting the profits according to their agreement and setting aside Eleanor's payment to Thornton's company, there was enough left over for both of them to feel genuinely optimistic about the future. "We did it," Eleanor said, her voice filled with wonder. "We actually did it." Jacob nodded, allowing himself a rare smile. "First season, many more to come." Mary appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleepy eyes. "Mama, is Mr. Sterling staying for supper?" Eleanor looked at Jacob, and for a moment something passed between them, unspoken but undeniable. It would have been easy for him to decline, to maintain the professional distance they had so carefully cultivated. But Jacob found himself nodding instead, found himself saying yes, that would be fine, surprising himself with how much he meant it. Supper was simple, stew and bread, but it tasted better than anything Jacob had eaten in months. Mary chatted about her day, showing Jacob a bird's nest she had found, and describing in elaborate detail the personalities of her mother's chickens. Eleanor laughed at her daughter's enthusiasm, and the sound filled the small house with warmth that had nothing to do with the heat of the stove. After the meal, as the sun set and painted the prairie in purples and pinks, Jacob prepared to leave. Mary hugged him goodbye without hesitation, her small arms wrapping around his waist with complete trust. Eleanor walked him to his horse, and they stood for a moment in the gathering twilight. "Jacob," Eleanor said, using his first name for the first time, "today was a good day. Thank you for making it possible." Jacob checked his saddle straps, buying himself time to find the right words. "Partnership," he finally said. "That is what makes it possible. Both of us working together, but it was more than that, and they both knew it. Somewhere between the contract signing and the cattle sale, between the shared work and the quiet conversations, their professional arrangement had started becoming something else. Neither was ready to name it or acknowledge it directly, but it was there nonetheless, growing like the prairie grass, persistent and undeniable. As Jacob rode home under the emerging stars, he realized he had not felt this settled, this connected to something larger than himself, since before he had left Missouri 8 years ago. It should have frightened him, should have triggered the old instinct to withdraw and protect himself. But instead, it felt like coming home to a place he had never been, but had been searching for all along. August brought challenges that tested the partnership in ways neither Jacob nor Eleanor had anticipated. First came the drought, 3 weeks without rain that turned the grass brittle and sent cattle searching for water that was increasingly scarce. Then came news that Thornton's company had been buying up land surrounding both properties, creating pressure from all sides. But the real storm arrived on a Thursday evening, in human form, when a rider appeared at Jacob's ranch carrying a letter with a Missouri postmark. Jacob recognized the handwriting before he opened it. His brother, Daniel, whom he had not spoken to in 8 years, was coming to Kansas. He wanted to discuss family business and reconciliation. Jacob crumpled the letter and threw it in the fire that night, watching the paper blacken and curl. But he could not burn away the memories or the anger that came with them. Daniel had inherited their father's ranch through manipulation and lies, had turned their mother against Jacob, had made it impossible for him to stay in the only home he had ever known. The next day, Jacob was shorter with his ranch hands, more withdrawn than usual. Eleanor noticed immediately. She found him repairing fence posts with unnecessary force, swinging the hammer like he was trying to drive something other than nails into the ground. "What happened?" she asked directly. She had learned that Jacob responded better to straightforward questions than to dancing around issues. Jacob continued working for a moment before answering. "Family trouble, from Missouri. Nothing that concerns the partnership." Eleanor sat on a nearby rock, making it clear she was not leaving until he talked. "Everything that affects you affects the partnership. That is how this works, remember? You taught me that." Jacob set down his hammer. "My brother is coming here. Wants to reconcile after 8 years of silence. After he took everything that should have been mine and made sure I knew I was not welcome in my own family anymore." Eleanor absorbed this quietly. "What will you do?" Jacob looked out across the prairie, toward the horizon where Kansas met the sky. "I do not know. Part of me wants to refuse to see him. Part of me wants to finally tell him exactly what his betrayal cost me. And part of me," Jacob paused, struggling with the admission, "part of me hopes he has a good explanation for everything." "That last part is the hardest," Eleanor said softly. "Hope is dangerous when you have been hurt. But it is also what makes us human. You do not have to decide anything right now. But when he arrives, you do not have to face him alone. We are partners, Jacob. That means something, at least to me." 3 days later, Daniel Sterling arrived in Covenant Springs. He was older, grayer, carrying himself with the weariness of a man who had traveled far for uncertain welcome. He asked around town for Jacob's location and was directed to the Hayes Ranch, where Jacob and Eleanor were working together to strengthen the barn before the autumn storms. Jacob saw his brother approaching and felt his entire body tense. Eleanor touched his arm briefly, a gesture of support, then moved to continue working, giving the brothers space but staying close enough to intervene if needed. "Jacob," Daniel said, dismounting slowly, "you look well. Kansas agrees with you." Jacob said nothing, just waited. He had learned patience in his years alone, learned to let silence do the work that words often failed to accomplish. Daniel removed his hat, turning it in his hands nervously. "I came to apologize for everything. Father's will, the way I handled the estate, the things I said to turn Mother against you. I was young and stupid and greedy, and I have spent 8 years regretting it." "Words are easy," Jacob finally said. "What took you 8 years to find them?" Daniel's face showed genuine pain, pride, shame. "Fear that you would not listen or that an apology could not fix what I broke. But Mother passed away last spring, and with her last words she asked about you. She wanted to know if I had made things right. So I promised her I would try. I am trying now, even if I am 8 years too late." The news of his mother's passing hit Jacob harder than he expected. He had left Missouri angry at her for believing Daniel's lies, but underneath that anger had always been love. Helena saw his reaction and moved closer, standing beside him in a way that made it clear she was there if he needed her. "What do you want from me?" Jacob asked quietly. "Just a chance to start over. I cannot give back the years we lost. I cannot undo the hurt. But I can offer you half of the Missouri property. It is rightfully yours. I have the legal documents drawn up already. No strings, no conditions. Just what should have been yours from the beginning." Jacob looked at Eleanor, then back at his brother. He thought about the choices that had brought him here, to this Kansas prairie, to this partnership that had become something more. He thought about how the worst moment of his life had eventually led him to Eleanor and Mary, to a chance at building something meaningful again. "I do not want the Missouri property," Jacob said. "My life is here now, but I will accept your apology. Not because it fixes everything, but because holding on to anger has not served me well. We cannot go back to being the brothers we were, Daniel. But maybe we can figure out how to be brothers in a new way." October arrived with the promise of harvest and the reality of Thornton's next move. The land company had been quiet through the summer, but silence from Thornton meant planning, not surrender. The blow came through legal channels this time. A notice that Frontier Land Development Company was challenging the partnership agreement on technical grounds, claiming it constituted a fraudulent transfer designed to avoid legitimate debt collection. Jacob and Eleanor found themselves back in the county courthouse, but this time facing a hearing before Judge Morrison, a man known for his strict interpretation of law and his impatience with emotional appeals. Thornton had hired a lawyer from Wichita, a sharp-faced man named Carstairs, who specialized in contract disputes and property law. The hearing room was packed with townspeople, all pretending they had business at the courthouse that particular morning. The church auxiliary sat in one section, the saloon regulars in another, and various merchants and ranchers filled the remaining seats. The whole county seemed to have a stake in the outcome. Carstairs presented his case with professional precision. He argued that the partnership was a sham designed specifically to prevent his client from collecting a legitimate debt. He pointed out that Jacob Sterling had no history of such business arrangements, that the timing was suspicious, and that the profit-sharing structure was unusually generous to Mrs. Hayes, suggesting charity disguised as business. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she listened to her integrity being questioned. Jacob wanted to reach over and take her hand to provide some comfort, but such a gesture in a courtroom would only support Carstairs' implications that something improper existed between them. When it was Jacob's turn to testify, he stood and spoke with quiet authority. "I formed this partnership because it made business sense. Mrs. Hayes' property provides water access I need. Her grazing land complements my herd rotation. The arrangement benefits both operations and creates efficiencies that increase profits for everyone involved." He paused, looking directly at Judge Morrison. "I do not make decisions based on emotion or charity. I make them based on what works." Carstairs tried to rattle him with aggressive questions, but Jacob's calm responses deflected each attack. Years of isolation had taught him to control his reactions, to reveal only what he chose to reveal. The lawyer grew increasingly frustrated, eventually overreaching with a question about Jacob's personal interest in Mrs. Hayes. "My personal interest," Jacob said slowly, "is in running a successful ranching operation. If you are suggesting something improper, say it clearly so we can address it directly, instead of hiding behind innuendo." Judge Morrison intervened before Carstairs could respond. "I will not have this hearing turned into a character assassination. Stick to the legal issues, counselor, or I will dismiss this challenge entirely." Eleanor testified next, describing the partnership's practical benefits and providing detailed financial records that showed legitimate business activity. She spoke clearly despite her nervousness, and Jacob felt a surge of admiration for her strength. This woman had faced down Thornton multiple times, had worked sunrise to sunset to save her home, and now stood before a judge defending her integrity with dignity and grace. The judge called a recess to review the documents. During the break, Daniel, who had stayed in town and attended the hearing, approached Jacob in the hallway. "You should marry her," he said without preamble. Jacob stared at his brother. "That is not relevant to this situation." Daniel smiled slightly. "Maybe not legally relevant, but it is relevant to your life. I can see how you look at her, Jacob, and I saw how she stood beside you earlier. That is not just a business partnership, and everyone in that courtroom knows it. The only two people pretending otherwise are you and her." Jacob had no response to that. He turned away, looking out the courthouse window at the town square where farmers were loading supplies and children were playing near the fountain. Daniel's words echoed in his mind, uncomfortable because they touched something Jacob had been carefully avoiding. The judge returned with his decision an hour later. "After reviewing the evidence and testimony, I find that the partnership agreement between Mr. Sterling and Mrs. Hayes is legitimate and was formed for valid business purposes. The timing may have been convenient, but convenience does not equal fraud. Mr. Thornton's company has no grounds to challenge this arrangement. Mrs. Hayes retains the right to pay her debt according to the schedule she and Mr. Sterling have established through their partnership earnings. The courtroom erupted in murmurs and whispers. Eleanor closed her eyes in relief, and Jacob allowed himself a small smile. Thornton and Carstairs gathered their papers in tight-lipped silence and left without comment. Outside on the courthouse steps, Eleanor finally let her emotions show. She leaned against the stone railing, her shoulders shaking slightly. Jacob stood beside her, not touching but close enough that his presence provided shelter from the curious eyes of the crowd dispersing around them. "It is over," Eleanor said. "We won," Jacob nodded. "The partnership is secure. Your land is secure. Everything we worked for is protected." But as he said it, he realized that somewhere along the way, the partnership had stopped being about land and cattle and business arrangements. It had become about two people finding their way back to trusting someone again. About discovering that isolation was not the same as safety. That walls built to keep pain out also kept joy out. Eleanor looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw the same realization. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Jacob did not have an answer, not yet, but for the first time in 8 years, he wanted to figure it out. November brought the kind of clear, cold days that made Kansas feel infinite. The sky, stretching blue and endless over prairie grass, turned golden. Jacob and Eleanor's partnership had survived its legal challenge and was now thriving beyond either's expectations. The cattle were healthy, the finances were solid, and even Thornton had finally given up, withdrawing his company's interest in Hayes' property and moving on to easier targets. But success in business had created a different kind of challenge, one neither Jacob nor Eleanor had been prepared to face. They had built their arrangement on professional boundaries and careful distance, but those barriers had eroded slowly over the months. Now they worked together with an ease that went beyond efficiency, spoke in shorthand that came from genuine understanding, and found themselves seeking each other's company, even when no business required it. Mary had started calling Jacob Mr. Jacob, and would run to greet him whenever he arrived, chattering about her day with the assumption that he cared about every detail, and Jacob discovered to his own surprise that he did care. He cared about Mary's drawing lessons and her hopes to own a pony someday. He cared about the way her face lit up when she solved a problem. He cared in ways he had not allowed himself to care about anyone in years. The town had stopped gossiping and started simply accepting. Jacob and Eleanor were seen as a unit now, partners who worked together and attended church together, and shared responsibilities with the kind of seamless coordination that looked almost like marriage without the legal ceremony. The church auxiliary ladies had begun making pointed comments about how lovely it would be to have a wedding to plan, and even the saloon regulars had given up their crude jokes in favor of grudging. Respect for how the arrangement had worked. Out. Daniel had returned to Missouri after the hearing, but not before having a long conversation with Jacob about second chances, and not letting fear prevent him from choosing happiness. His brother's words had planted seeds that Jacob could not quite ignore. Questions about what he really wanted versus what he had convinced himself was enough. The moment of decision came unexpectedly on a Thursday afternoon. Eleanor had invited Jacob for supper, as had become their custom twice weekly. But when he arrived, he found her standing in the yard, staring at a letter in her hands, her expression troubled. "What is wrong?" Jacob asked immediately. Eleanor looked up and he saw fear in her eyes for the first time since the hearing. "My sister in Philadelphia. She has written offering me a home, a fresh start. She says Mary could attend proper schools there, have opportunities she will never have in Kansas. She says I have fought hard enough, that it is time to accept help from family and leave this life behind." Jacob felt something cold settle in his chest. "What will you do?" Eleanor handed him the letter. "Read it yourself. It is a generous offer. She means well, and she is not wrong about the opportunities. Mary would have advantages in Philadelphia that I cannot give her here. A mother should want the best for her child." Jacob read the letter slowly, seeing between the lines the same story he knew too well. Eleanor's sister saw Kansas as a hardship, saw the ranch as a burden, saw Eleanor's determination to stay as stubbornness rather than strength. The letter was kind but condescending, offering rescue from a life the writer could not imagine anyone choosing willingly. He folded the letter and handed it back. "Is that what you want? City life, your sister's charity, leaving everything you have built here?" Eleanor's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "I do not know what I want anymore, Jacob. I came here because Thomas dreamed of building something lasting. I stayed because I would not let anyone take that dream away from me. But maybe I am being selfish. Maybe Mary deserves more than a life of hard work and uncertainty." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with his own fear of speaking too honestly. Then he said something he had not planned, something that came from a part of himself he had kept locked away for years. "She deserves a mother who is happy, and you are happy here. I see it when you work with the cattle, when you look out over the land, when you watch Mary run through the grass. You are not staying out of stubbornness or obligation. You are staying because this is where you belong." Eleanor wiped her eyes. "And what about you, Jacob? Where do you belong?" He could have deflected, could have changed the subject back to business and partnerships. But standing there in her yard, with the afternoon light turning everything gold, Jacob found he was tired of hiding. "I belong here too. Not just Kansas, not just my ranch. Here with you and Mary. That is what I want, Eleanor. I want to stop pretending this is just a business arrangement. I want to make this partnership real in every way that matters." Eleanor's breath caught. "Jacob Sterling, are you proposing to me?" Jacob smiled, a real smile that transformed his usually serious face. "I suppose I am. Badly, without preparation or poetry. But honestly, I love you, Eleanor. I love your strength and your determination. I love how you fight for what matters. I love watching you with Mary. I love that you see past my silences to who I actually am. And if you will have me, I want to spend the rest of my life building something real with you." Mary appeared in the doorway at that moment, sensing something important was happening. "Mama, why are you crying?" Eleanor laughed through her tears. "Because Mr. Jacob just asked me to marry him, sweetheart." Mary's eyes went wide with delight. "Does that mean he will live here all the time? And read me stories? And teach me to ride better?" Eleanor looked at Jacob, her expression full of hope and happiness, and the relief of finally admitting what had been true for months. "Yes," she said. "If we say yes, that is exactly what it means." Jacob held out his hand and Eleanor took it. Her fingers were rough from work, but warm with life. Mary ran over and wrapped her arms around both of them, and for the first time in 8 years, Jacob Sterling felt complete. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the Covenant Springs Church, with half the county in attendance. Daniel came from Missouri to stand as Jacob's best man, and the church auxiliary ladies outdid themselves with decorations and a reception that became legendary in town history. But the real celebration happened later, back at the ranch that now belonged to all three of them. Jacob had moved his operation to Eleanor's property, combining everything into one thriving spread that stretched across the prairie. They sat on the porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky, Mary asleep inside after the excitement of the day. Eleanor leaned against Jacob's shoulder. "We did something impossible, you know. We took a terrible situation and turned it into something beautiful." Jacob wrapped his arm around her. "We did what needed doing. No more, no less." Eleanor smiled at that, at his habit of understating everything, but she knew the truth. They had done something extraordinary. They had chosen courage over fear, partnership over isolation, and love over the safety of keeping everyone at distance. The Kansas wind picked up, carrying the scent of autumn grass and distant rain. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new work to be done. But tonight, sitting together on their porch, Jacob and Eleanor had everything they needed, each other, a home built through shared effort, and the knowledge that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is let someone else in.